Hey guys, tonight we start with something highly relatable, sleep, or more specifically, how medieval people actually slept, which turns out to be far stranger than most of us might imagine. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. Before electricity, TikTok, and sleep hygiene influencers, medieval people approached nighttime with a schedule that would completely baffle the modern melatonin enthusiast. It was known as segmented sleep, a natural, two-part sleep cycle split neatly in half like a stale medieval biscuit. The pattern was simple. After sundown, most people went to bed early, drifting into what was called first sleep. Then, after roughly 4 hours, they would wake up intentionally and spend the next hour or two doing what can only be described as medieval midnight multitasking. This wasn't considered insomnia, it was simply the way sleep worked. Hey guys, tonight we start with something highly relatable, sleep, or more specifically, how medieval people actually slept, which turns out to be far stranger than most of us might imagine. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. Before electricity, TikTok, and sleep hygiene influencers, medieval people approached nighttime with a schedule that would completely baffle the modern melatonin enthusiast. It was known as segmented sleep, a natural, two-part sleep cycle split neatly in half like a stale medieval biscuit. The pattern was simple. After sundown, most people went to bed early, drifting into what was called first sleep. Then, after roughly 4 hours, they would wake up intentionally and spend the next hour or two doing what can only be described as medieval midnight multitasking. This wasn't considered insomnia, it was simply the way sleep worked. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a drink, it was a hat. A real, tangible, often ridiculous-looking piece of fabric designed to keep your head from freezing off while you slept. You see, insulation wasn't exactly the strong point of medieval architecture. Stone walls, drafty thatched roofs, and windows made of thin animal horn or oiled parchment didn't do much against the cold. And central heating? That was called a dog. To keep their heads warm at night, especially since body heat escapes fastest through the scalp, medieval people embraced the humble nightcap. These came in all shapes and sizes, but the most iconic version was long and pointed, like something you'd expect on a wizard who moonlights as a chimney sweep. They were usually made from wool, linen, or whatever scrap of warmth could be spared without upsetting the family goat. For men, it was a practical accessory. For women, it sometimes doubled as a coif or head wrap, which also served the dual purpose of maintaining modesty and hiding hair that hadn't seen soap since last Lent. But beyond warmth, nightcaps carried social weight too. In some regions, married women were expected to cover their heads at all times. Yes, even while asleep. And the cap itself could be embroidered or dyed to reflect a family's wealth or status, because nothing says success quite like going to bed with a tiny fabric flag on your head. In more urban settings, the nightcap even became a symbol of being off-duty. If you opened your door wearing one, it was the medieval equivalent of saying, "I'm not dressed for conversation." And yes, the hat did mean go away. Of course, nightcaps were often paired with nightshirts, essentially long, loose tunics. Picture Ebenezer Scrooge, minus the ghostly moral intervention. Sleepwear wasn't sexy, but it was practical, itchy, and occasionally flammable. Today, the idea of sleeping next to a stranger is generally reserved for red-eye flights, overly ambitious camping trips, or the occasional bizarre Airbnb mix-up. But in medieval Europe, it was completely normal and not remotely optional. Let's say you're a traveling merchant, a pilgrim, or just someone whose mule gave up halfway to Norwich. You find an inn, a rare luxury in itself, and ask for a place to sleep. What you get isn't a room or a bed, or even a particularly clean floor. What you get is a spot in a bed that's already occupied. Medieval inns operated more like human bunkhouses than modern hotels. Privacy wasn't expected. If the bed had space, you were sharing it, usually with complete strangers who might snore, talk in their sleep, or have a suspicious number of boils. And no, this was not considered rude, since everyone was too tired, cold, and possibly malnourished to make small talk anyway. The vow of silence wasn't just spiritual discipline, it was also a practical defense against medieval gossip, which could metastasize faster than the plague itself. In a world without social media, a whispered rumor in the candlelit dormitory could travel across town by sunrise, embellished with at least 3 extra sins you didn't commit. Best to just keep your mouth shut. Let the mice in the rafters provide the night's entertainment, and hope you woke up still breathing. And waking up wasn't always guaranteed to be a pleasant experience. The medieval morning alarm clock was a mix of roosters crowing, bells tolling, carts rumbling over cobblestone, and the person next to you finally rolling over after pinning your blanket hostage all night. Sometimes it was the innkeeper's lad shaking you awake because you were overdue to leave and someone else was already glaring from the doorway, clutching their sack of turnips and waiting for your bed. Privacy didn't exist in this setting, it was a concept reserved for royalty, criminals on trial, and occasionally cats. If you were unlucky enough to share with a chronic snorer, there were no foam earplugs to save you. Instead, your options were prod them with a foot, stuff your ears with wool, or invent elaborate revenge fantasies involving chamber pots. Even in monasteries, where the snoring was theoretically conducted in a spirit of humility, the sound could rise like a holy chorus of congested angels. You didn't complain though. Complaints were frowned upon, and besides, you might need their help fending off the rats later. Travelers who could afford it sometimes brought their own bedding, not just for comfort, but for self-preservation. Inns didn't wash sheets with anything resembling regularity. A clean bed might mean the previous occupant had been dead less than a week. The mattress was usually a sack stuffed with straw, which flattened into a lumpy mat after enough bodies had compressed it. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs considered these mattresses rent-free paradise. Some guests brought along a sleeping sack, essentially a personal cocoon sewn from linen, which you could climb into and hope kept the crawling wildlife on the outside. This wasn't guaranteed. Yet despite the discomfort, the smells, and the spiritual risk of accidentally dying mid-dream, there was still something communal about it. People swapped stories in the dim light before sleep, shared bread, wine, and occasionally dubious meat pies. News and gossip flowed from one bed to the next, traveling with the itinerant merchants, soldiers, and peddlers who drifted through the door. These crowded beds were where legends grew legs, where a rumor about a dragon 2 towns over could be born, fattened, and shipped onward by morning. And so, under the rafters, wrapped in scratchy wool, stomachs growling, people dozed off with the knowledge that survival was not a solitary affair. It was a group project, complete with shared blankets and occasional elbows to the ribs. Because everyone was already exhausted, underfed, and mildly afraid of the dark, children were also encouraged to pray, in part because it was good for their souls and in part because it gave them something to do other than ask why the dog was in their bed again. Parents reminded them that angels were watching, which sounds adorable until you realize it was less guardian angel and more celestial surveillance system. In short, prayer before sleep was less about peace and more about last-minute damage control. Think of it like medieval antivirus software. You hoped it worked, even if you didn't fully understand how. In the modern world, dreams are usually dismissed as random nonsense, stress, too much cheese, or your brain trying to file paperwork in the dark. But in the medieval world, dreams were taken very seriously, as in eternal consequences. Serious dreams weren't just dreams, they were considered messages from God's saints, the devil, your guardian angel, or possibly that weird relic you kissed last Sunday. Some dreams were divine revelations, others were demonic temptations. Either way, you were supposed to pay attention and possibly write it down or confess it or fast for 3 days just to be safe. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed visionaries spent an alarming amount of time interpreting dreams. Entire texts were dedicated to decoding them. Dreamt of fire might be hell, dreamt of water could mean purification or drowning. Dreamt of a man with a goat's head juggling fish, you'd better call it priest immediately and possibly move. Medieval people believed that what happened in dreams mattered because your soul was still active while you slept. This meant that your actions in a dream could reveal hidden sins or spiritual weaknesses. That mildly embarrassing dream about stealing a loaf of bread, that might be your subconscious confessing your guilt for real-world gluttony or just hunger, but still better to confess it anyway just in case. Monks and nuns often recorded their dreams and shared Them with spiritual superiors, some were celebrated for having holy visions during sleep, others were quietly told to eat fewer onions before bed. Of course, dreams weren't just spiritual puzzles, they also made excellent plot devices. Medieval literature is full of dream sequences where knights encounter angels, demons, or metaphorical creatures spouting poetry about virtue. Dreams were basically the Netflix of the medieval world, except with more allegory and fewer happy endings. The church, predictably, was suspicious. Not all dreams were divine, and some were believed to be planted by demons to corrupt the innocent. If you dreamt of something unwholesome, it could mean your soul was under attack, or that you just slept too close to the fireplace fumes again, already prepared for the misery ahead. And yes, 2 a.m. prayers were non-negotiable. The bell would toll, echoing through the stone corridors like a reminder from God himself that sleep was a luxury, not a right. Monks would shuffle from their beds, if bed is the correct term for a board with delusions of comfort, wrap themselves tighter in their habits, and head to the chapel for matins, the first of several daily services. This ritual interruption wasn't designed for convenience. It was meant to remind you that spiritual discipline outranked physical rest every single time. The lack of privacy in these dormitories was deliberate. A solitary cell was a privilege for only the most senior or saintly members, and even then, it was more like a broom closet with an upgraded mattress. For the rest, sleeping in full view of dozens of others was considered good for humility. You couldn't indulge in laziness without everyone noticing, nor could you sulk in a corner without the abbot asking what demons you were wrestling with. Your life was an open book, and everyone could read the chapter where you rolled over and fell asleep mid-prayer. Heating was minimal to non-existent. Fires in the dormitory were rare, partly because wood was expensive, and partly because the risk of accidentally roasting a monk was considered too high. Instead, warmth came from layers of clothing, shared air, and sheer endurance. Drafts slid in through any gap they could find, and the stone walls acted like giant refrigerators, preserving the chill long into spring. In winter, your breath fogged the air, and the straw mattress beneath you developed a permanent icy crust. It was a test of both faith and circulation. Noise, though frowned upon, was inevitable. A room full of human beings will make sound, even if every one of them has sworn an oath to silence. There were coughs, the shifting of robes, the occasional creak of wood, and the steady symphony of breathing, sometimes gentle, sometimes wheezing, sometimes startlingly loud. Snoring, while not exactly encouraged, was tolerated with the same resigned acceptance as death and taxes. The only exception was if a monk's snoring was so bad it disrupted prayer. In such cases, the offender might be invited to sleep elsewhere, which was the monastic equivalent of being sent to the couch. For new arrivals, the shock was intense. Imagine coming from a small village where you at least shared a bed with family and livestock you knew, only to be dropped into a regimented hall of strangers where affection was replaced by obligation. Yet over time, most adapted. The monotony became its own comfort, the rigid schedule a kind of security. In the stillness between bells, you could almost forget your bed was made of planks and that the cold was slowly chewing through your bones. You weren't here for comfort. You were here for God, and apparently he had a very strict bedtime policy. Because standing upright on cold stone in wool robes while the body screams for warmth and horizontal relief is surprisingly exhausting. Eyes would water from smoke, noses run from drafts, and feet ached in sandals designed more for humility than comfort. Yet the monks persevered. Falling asleep mid-chant wasn't just frowned upon. It was considered a spiritual failing. You could nod off and risk the abbot's stern glance, or worse, a whispered admonishment later that felt like a judicial review of your soul. Some monks developed elaborate techniques to stay upright, gripping the edge of a pew, lightly tapping a staff, or subtly shifting weight from one foot to the other, all while trying not to disrupt the chorus of equally sleep-deprived voices around them. The canonical hours didn't end with matins. Lauds followed, then prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline, all punctuated by bells, footsteps, and occasional creaks of ancient wood. Each service demanded attentiveness, a quiet mind, and perfect posture. Sleep had to be meticulously scheduled between these hours, and naps were brief, strategic, and often supervised in the sense that everyone else's upright vigilance reminded you not to get too comfortable. Dreaming, even if brief, was suspicious. Visions could be divine, yes, but they could also be temptations from demons lurking in the shadows of your imagination. Better to keep the mind occupied with scripture than risk waking up spiritually compromised. Monastic bedding, as previously mentioned, was austere to the point of cruelty. Straw or rough wool mats were common, sometimes supplemented with a thin wooden plank for the truly disciplined. No pillow, no mattress padding beyond the straw, nothing to soften the ceaseless reminder that the body was subordinate to the soul. Some monks trained themselves to sleep sitting or kneeling, a posture that supposedly reduced indulgence in dreams and reinforced the principle of constant spiritual readiness. Waking from such a position wasn't gentle. You stiffened, groaned, and staggered to your feet like a small, pious zombie, all before another bell tolled to summon you to the next ritual. Temperature control was essentially non-existent. Candles provided minimal light and almost no warmth. The stone walls acted like refrigerators, drafts were persistent, and the only heat came from layering clothing or, in rare cases, huddling discreetly near a fellow monk's body heat, which was frowned upon but quietly tolerated in extreme cases. The goal wasn't comfort, it was endurance. Every shiver, every stiff joint, every snapped sandal strap was a lesson in humility, a reminder that the flesh is weak and the spirit must triumph. By comparison, peasant homes, even with pigs, goats, and chickens in the same room, looked like luxury suites. A straw pile shared with animals might be lumpy, scratchy, and occasionally bitten, but at least it was warm, flexible, and free from moral judgment. If a pig nudged your toe at 3 a.m., it was merely inconvenient. If a monk nudged your soul awake at the same hour, the consequences could be eternal, or at least socially awkward. In both cases, sleep was a precious commodity, carefully rationed and meticulously surveilled. Yet the monastery added layers of discipline, ritual, and subtle terror that made surviving the night feel like an accomplishment worthy of sainthood. These weren't whimsical fairy tales designed to soothe you to sleep. They were cautionary manuals disguised as stories, filled with examples of restless spirits, mischievous fae, and morally questionable ghosts who prowled the darkened corners of your room. A child left alone at night might be snatched by an ill-tempered imp, suffer bad dreams that were spiritually consequential, or simply develop a bad habit that could imperil the family's collective fortune. Sleeping with siblings or neighbors wasn't just warmth. It was a shield, a network of tiny, half-conscious bodyguards warding off supernatural interference while the adults prayed, muttered incantations, or occasionally snored in their own morally protective clusters. Even among adults, solitary sleep carried undertones of vulnerability. A single person lying alone in the dark might attract more than just cold. Tales abounded of demonic whispers creeping in through keyholes or windows left ajar, of spectral figures exploiting the isolation to sow unrest in a soul. The moral was simple. Stay together, stay alert, and hope your bedmates were awake enough to notice if something, or someone, malevolent slipped past your defenses. In inns, this principle merged with practicality. Travelers sharing a bed weren't necessarily friends, but together they formed a micro-community capable of deterring thieves, wild animals, and the occasional drunk noble who thought he could claim your blanket as well as your coin pouch. Physical proximity also had the advantage of communal vigilance. One person's movement, cough, or subtle shift in the straw pile could serve as an alarm for the rest. Bundled together, humans could leverage collective heat, sound, and presence to survive a night that otherwise might have been fatal, whether due to the elements, disease, or random attacks by opportunistic highwaymen. Social rules emerged alongside this necessity. Elbow territory was fiercely defended. Rolling over into someone else's space could start a minor dispute, and the first to claim a prime position near the fire or doorway often set the standard for the rest. Religious and superstitious thinking layered over these practical arrangements. Sleeping alone was considered not only risky but spiritually questionable. The night was a liminal space when worldly and otherworldly boundaries blurred. Vulnerability was amplified, and so companionship became a moral as well as physical requirement. Children were instructed in prayers that could be recited communally. Adults engaged in whispered invocations to saints, and the occasional vigilant parent would patrol the room to ensure no one drifted too far into morally dangerous slumber. It was not comfort that guided these habits but survival, both corporeal and eternal. By contrast, modern ideals of solitary sleep, peace, autonomy, undisturbed rest would have seemed indulgent, even reckless, in the medieval mindset. Privacy could be a luxury that exposed one to both natural and supernatural threats. Solitude at night was suspicious, implying either social weakness, poor judgment, or spiritual fragility. In essence, medieval sleeping arrangements were a combination of body heat, moral insurance, and communal defense. A reminder that in a world of cold stone, devils, and unpredictable neighbors, surviving the night was a team sport, and the bed was the playing field. Your soul with the departed, or worse, invite premature judgment. Sleeping upright was a subtle, constant reminder that your body was temporary but your spirit required vigilance. It was posture as precaution, a way to maintain moral and physical awareness even while unconscious. Some devout individuals took this to extremes. Wooden wedges, inclined benches, or even elaborate rope and pulley systems held the sleeper in a semi-reclined position all night, ensuring that neither comfort nor deep, potentially sin-inducing sleep could take over. For the wealthy, sleeping upright also had the benefit of maintaining appearances. Beds were often elaborate affairs with canopies, curtains, and fine linens, and reclining too much could crease garments or disrupt the visual order expected by visiting clergy, guests, or even family. The posture itself became a subtle social statement, disciplined, pious, and alert to both spiritual and worldly demands. The truly devout layered this upright sleep with prayer beads, talismans, or protective charms, creating a miniature spiritual fortress around their still conscious body. In monasteries, this practice blended seamlessly with communal austerity. Wooden planks and thin straw offered little comfort, so sleeping upright was not just about digestion or spirituality. It also reduced the temptation to drift into luxurious slumber. Nuns and monks who could maintain this posture were thought to be training both body and soul, strengthening discipline and resisting the natural pull of dreams, which were seen as either divine messages or demonic snares. Any lapse risked both embarrassment and reprimand. Even among ordinary folk, the upright sleep had practical benefits. In crowded homes or shared sleeping quarters, lying flat could mean your head ended up too close to a sibling, a pig, or the neighbor's visiting cousin. Sitting up reduced the likelihood of elbow battles, blanket theft, and unexpected toes in your face. It also facilitated readiness. If a fire broke out, if the livestock panicked, or if a nocturnal intruder appeared, you were already partially alert and able to respond faster than if you were fully horizontal. So while modern sleepers groan at the idea of waking with a stiff neck, medieval people treated such aches as a minor inconvenience, the price of spiritual prudence, communal safety, and bodily management. Comfort was secondary to survival, virtue, and social expectations. In essence, upright sleep was a lifestyle choice that blurred the line between devotion, practicality, and slightly sadistic habit, a nightly exercise in endurance, vigilance, and moral preparedness. And they were utterly indifferent to your prayers, your social status, or whether you just spent an hour reciting psalms. Unlike demons or mischievous spirits, bed bugs didn't follow moral or spiritual rules. They were punctual, efficient, and merciless. By morning, your straw mattress could resemble a crime scene, red with bites and itchy welts, a cruel reminder that survival and comfort were rarely synonymous. Fleas and lice added insult to injury, crawling through hair, beards, and even clothing, ensuring that no medieval sleeper could truly rest without engaging in a nightly battle of microscopic proportions. Hygiene interventions were creative, if grim. Some families sprinkled herbs like rosemary or lavender among the straw, hoping the scent would repel insects. Nobles often bathed in perfumed oils, not for cleanliness so much as to mask the scent that attracted pests, or to assert that, despite appearances, they were still civilized humans. In extreme cases, mattresses were periodically discarded or burned, a violent but effective pest control strategy that doubled as an excuse to buy new straw or feather filling. Still, these measures were only partially effective. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were resilient, persistent, and, most importantly, patient. For travelers and peasants sharing beds in inns or communal halls, the situation was equally grim. Bundles of blankets and luggage offered some barrier, but the close quarters meant that one person's infestation quickly became everyone's problem. Children, who often slept intermingled with adults and even animals, were especially vulnerable. Some parents tied their purses or valuables to their belts to guard against thieves. Others wrapped themselves in multiple layers as a feeble defense against blood-sucking intruders. The medieval bedroom was not a sanctuary. It was a battlefield where body heat, human error, and poor hygiene combined to make every night a gamble. Despite this, people endured. Fleas were tolerated as a minor nuisance, lice combed out religiously, and bedbugs, well, you learned to live with the bites. Survival, after all, required pragmatism. Much like sleeping upright or sharing a bed for warmth and spiritual protection, coexisting with these pests was part of the medieval knight's routine. A healthy dose of prayer, communal vigilance, and occasional violent fumigation was about the best strategy anyone could hope for. Sleep wasn't about comfort or luxury. It was a brief interlude between labor, devotion, and the relentless realities of disease, cold, and infestation. The line between discomfort and danger was thin. Some bites became infected, scratching led to fevers, and in extreme cases, poor hygiene facilitated the spread of lice-borne diseases. Yet humans adapted. Techniques ranged from shaking out bedding at dawn to strategic placement of animals on or near beds to distract or reduce the number of pests. In essence, the medieval night was an ecosystem. Humans, animals, insects, and the occasional restless spirit all vying for space, warmth, and survival. Bedbugs, the silent, patient predators, were simply the most efficient of all, reminding sleepers that the real monsters of the night were neither spectral nor imaginary. They were tiny, persistent, and entirely unconcerned with your soul. Because medieval life was full of sudden threats, and preparedness was considered a form of piety as much as practicality. A traveling noble might don a padded gambeson or leather jerkins while sleeping, reasoning that a little extra armor could save his life if brigands or thieves struck at dawn. Even monks in border abbeys sometimes kept a dagger under their robes at night, not for style, but for the occasional need to ward off intruders, both human and otherwise. Sleep, in this context, wasn't a retreat from the world. It was a strategic pause in which vigilance had to be maintained. For knights, soldiers, and men-at-arms, the line between rest and readiness was thin. A half-donned breastplate might make rolling over uncomfortable, but it allowed for a faster response should an alarm be sounded. Helmets, gloves, and greaves were often left nearby or partially worn, and weapons were kept within reach. The sounds of creaking chainmail and clinking iron might have kept the lighter sleepers awake, but they were a reassuring soundtrack for those who understood that danger rarely respected bedtime. Even in camp, groups would sleep in shifts, relying on one another to maintain a perimeter, meaning that nighttime peace was a collective, often exhausting endeavor. Armor aside, the medieval sleeping environment was harsh. Stone floors, straw mattresses, or wooden planks offered minimal comfort, and blankets were thin or shared among multiple people. Pets and livestock added both warmth and chaos. Pigs rooting near the fireplace, dogs curled at your feet, and cats patrolling for fleas. Candles flickered, casting shadows that could easily be interpreted as wandering spirits, and drafts swept in through poorly sealed doors and windows. In this setting, even a partially armored sleeper could rest only lightly, half-conscious and ready to react at the first sign of trouble. The psychological impact was subtle but persistent. Sleeping while prepared for conflict, or haunted by the knowledge that pests, thieves, or demons could strike, meant that medieval people rarely experienced the deep, uninterrupted sleep we take for granted today. Naps were brief, shifts were necessary, and the body adapted to survive under constant alertness. It wasn't uncommon for people to rise stiff, scratched, and weary, yet grateful simply to have survived the night intact. In essence, medieval sleep was a balancing act. Between warmth and exposure, comfort and vigilance, spiritual preparation and bodily endurance, all while sharing space with humans, animals, and the ever-present microscopic predators that ignored prayers, social status, and chain mail alike. Was treated with a mixture of fear, superstition, and sometimes outright ritual. If someone rose from their bed in the dead of night, neighbors might bang on doors, sprinkle holy water, or mutter prayers to chase away whatever spirit or demon was thought to have taken hold. Families often tied ropes around sleepwalkers' waists or placed them in small, confined spaces to prevent injury, though this was less about safety than preventing the scandal of being caught wandering naked or muttering obscenities in the dark. In extreme cases, local clergy were called to perform blessings or exorcisms, because a wandering soul was seen as a potential threat to both itself and the community. Sleepwalking could carry moral as well as physical consequences. To appear in the wrong place at the wrong hour might be interpreted as a secret pact with evil forces, an omen of illness, or evidence of sin lurking in the heart. Courts sometimes even considered noctambulation when assessing claims of witchcraft or possession, because if your nightly wanderings seemed suspiciously purposeful, or you tripped over someone else's goat, you could be questioned under both spiritual and civil law. The boundary between accident, ailment, and supernatural interference was remarkably thin. Despite the fear, sleepwalking was also accommodated practically. Families learned to secure their homes with simple measures: wedges under doors, heavy objects to slow movement, or companions assigned to guard the sleepwalker throughout the night. It became part of the communal night rhythm, like shared blankets or huddling for warmth. And yet, the anxiety it provoked was very real. Waking up mid-journey through the village, or worse, in someone else's bed, could provoke scandal, injury, or spiritual panic. In monasteries, noctambulation was even more dangerous spiritually. A monk or nun rising without permission might be interpreted as a lapse in discipline, a demonic influence, or an invitation for temptation. Dormitories would wake at the slightest disturbance, and the sleepwalker risked public rebuke or additional chores as punishment. The combination of superstition, physical danger, and social consequence made wandering in sleep a high-stakes endeavor. Unlike today, where you might simply chuckle at a sleepwalking roommate, medieval noctambulation demanded vigilance, ritual, and occasionally full-scale community intervention. Every few decades, sleep became a rare but necessary refuge. In a time without anesthetics, therapists, or Netflix, closing your eyes was sometimes the only way to negotiate a temporary truce with reality. People learned to sleep through almost anything. The shrill cry of a child, the clatter of carts over cobblestones, the lowing of cattle in crowded rooms, and yes, even the occasional plague-ridden corpse being carted down the street. The body adapted to chaos, training itself to find micronaps between chores, prayers, and disasters, while the mind learned to tune out, or at least partially ignore, the constant soundtrack of medieval life. For many, sleep also carried spiritual weight. Closing your eyes didn't just mean rest. It was a liminal moment where dreams, omens, and divine messages could slip in. Those who survived childhood learned to sleep lightly but deeply, always ready to wake at the toll of a bell, the shriek of a storm, or the arrival of a neighbor delivering news of death or misfortune. Communities developed informal systems of alert. A neighbor's shout, a dog's bark, or the clang of a pan might serve as early warning for intruders, floods, or fires. Sleep was never entirely solitary or entirely safe, but it was necessary. Weather, noise, and human activity were treated as ambient conditions rather than obstacles. Thunderstorms rattled rafters, winds whistled through cracks, and rain leaked through thatched roofs. But with enough repetition, these became part of the subconscious rhythm. Just as modern sleepers might tune out traffic or a dripping faucet, medieval people learned to filter the chaos and carve out the essential function of sleep: survival. The occasional siege or plague cart merely added another layer of background noise, a reminder that life continued in sleep, brief though it was, remained non-negotiable. Even in the face of extreme stress, famine, disease, taxation, or apocalyptic rumor, people adapted by compartmentalizing sleep as both physical necessity and temporary mental reprieve. For the exhausted, underfed, and constantly vigilant, shutting one's eyes was a rare moment of agency in a life dominated by external pressures. Sleep, in the medieval sense, was less about comfort and more about endurance, a precarious negotiation between body, spirit, and the relentless, noisy, chaotic world that waited just outside the straw-stuffed mattress or cold stone floor. Quickly became the center of attention, their behaviors interpreted as undeniable proof of supernatural interference. Every twitch, scream, or fainting spell was scrutinized, catalogued, and debated as evidence of the devil's work. Neighbors watched each other with suspicion, eyes darting for any hint of a curse or malevolent glance. Personal grievances, long-standing rivalries, and fear of the unknown intertwined, creating fertile ground for accusation. In a society where spiritual authority and community reputation were intertwined, the line between reality and hysteria blurred almost immediately. Once the first accusations were made, the machinery of paranoia gained momentum. Names were whispered in hushed tones, repeated in sermons, and eventually shouted in courtrooms. The village, already insulated by the long, harsh winter and steeped in Puritan doctrine, became a pressure cooker of fear. Adults and children alike internalized the belief that witches walked among them, disguised as the familiar and ordinary. Every misfortune, sick livestock, failed crops, illness was now a potential act of dark magic. And with Betty Paris and Abigail Williams as both witnesses and accusers, the community had what it considered irrefutable evidence. The afflicted, in their thrall, spoke, and the devil's hand was everywhere. The social dynamics of Salem amplified the hysteria. Marginalized women, widows, the poor, those who defied gender norms, were the first to be accused, a reflection of both vulnerability and envy. But soon, no one was beyond suspicion. Respectable citizens, long considered pillars of the community, found themselves named, interrogated, and imprisoned. The courts, swayed by a combination of fear, superstition, and rigid adherence to Puritan law, accepted spectral evidence, dreams, and confessions extracted under duress. In this environment, truth became malleable, replaced by the logic of fear. If someone was accused, they must be guilty. If they denied it, the devil had clouded their mind. As the accusations multiplied, the village descended further into panic. Community bonds frayed under the weight of mistrust. Neighbors became sentinels, watching for signs of unnatural behavior in each other's children, servants, and spouses. The once familiar rhythms of daily life, work, prayer, social interaction, were overshadowed by the omnipresent anxiety of being watched, judged, or accused. What began in the Paris household as strange illness or unexplained behavior escalated into a full-scale witch hunt, one where fear, theology, and human suspicion converged into tragedy, shaping the legacy of Salem for centuries to come. The court accepted spectral evidence, dreams, and the sworn testimony of the afflicted as sufficient proof of guilt. If a girl claimed to see a spirit attacking her, the accused could be convicted without any physical corroboration. Judges, eager to assert authority and contain the spreading panic, allowed hearsay and emotionally charged accusations to carry the weight of law. Defense was nearly impossible. To challenge the girls was to risk being labeled a witch yourself. To question spectral evidence was to question God. And to delay judgment was to invite the devil's influence. Once the machinery was in motion, it fed on itself. Each conviction emboldened new accusations. Fear and envy intertwined. Neighbors used the chaos to settle old scores. Widows and social outcasts became convenient targets, and even respected families could find themselves swept into the web. Prisons quickly filled, conditions deteriorated, and the accused, whether guilty or not, faced grim prospects. Confessions, sometimes coerced, sometimes fabricated, further fueled the hysteria, reinforcing the notion that witchcraft was everywhere, invisible but deadly, and that the only protection was suspicion, vigilance, and strict adherence to court dictates. The court of Oyer and Terminer became infamous not for justice, but for its efficiency in processing fear. Trials were spectacles of terror. The afflicted girls would contort and scream in court, pointing fingers, naming names, and demanding punishment. Judges and townspeople alike were caught in a feedback loop where panic validated accusation, and accusation justified panic. Community bonds shattered as no one was immune. Silence became the safest refuge, and even the most mundane events, sick animals, broken fences, an unexpected cough, could be interpreted as evidence of the devil's work. By mid-1692, Salem had transformed from a quiet Puritan village into a theater of dread. The legal system, warped by superstition and fear, ensured that hysteria had institutional backing. What began as strange behavior in Reverend Paris's household spiraled into a tragedy that would claim lives, reputations, and the moral certainty of an entire community. In Salem, logic and evidence were subordinate to fear, and the machinery of accusation churned relentlessly, leaving behind a legacy of suspicion, cruelty, and enduring historical fascination. Then the stones themselves, more weight, he supposedly commanded, refusing to yield even in the face of unbearable agony. His defiance became a chilling symbol of resistance against the machinery of fear, a stark contrast to the helpless compliance demanded of most accused witches. Meanwhile, the village of Salem continued its descent. Hysteria was now institutionalized, each accusation feeding the next, each execution reinforcing the pervasive terror. By autumn of 1692, the scale of the tragedy was staggering. Families were torn apart, neighbors no longer trusted neighbors, and children had been transformed into instruments of judgment. Spectral evidence had created a system where imagination and fear held more weight than fact or reason. The court's procedures, designed to protect the community, instead magnified panic and legitimized cruelty. Every new accusation carried the weight of precedent. The girls had screamed, someone had confessed, someone else had died, and therefore the cycle had to continue. Even beyond the hangings and the pressings, the psychological toll on Salem survivors was immense. Families who had lost mothers, fathers, and siblings were left to navigate guilt, grief, and lingering suspicion. The once close-knit community fractured under the strain, and many would carry the stigma and trauma for generations. Those who had spoken against the trials, who had questioned the girls or the court, were themselves targets of fear, ensuring that silence, whether from guilt or self-preservation, became the dominant strategy. By the time the panic subsided and the courts dissolved in 1693, dozens had been executed, others imprisoned, and countless more accused. The Salem witch trials remained a cautionary tale of what happens when fear overrides reason, when children's theatrics become law, and when spectral evidence, something that could neither be verified nor disproven, determines life or death. The village, forever scarred, stood as a reminder that hysteria, once unleashed, can entrap an entire community in a nightmare more enduring than any dream. This created a vicious feedback loop. Confession became survival, accusation became protection, and the hysteria fed on itself. Families were torn apart as parents, children, and siblings found themselves both victims and involuntary accusers. The social fabric of Salem unraveled as trust evaporated. Neighbors stopped speaking freely, and even casual disputes could spiral into deadly consequences. Ownership of land, minor disputes, or simply being different could be enough to attract suspicion, turning everyday life into a minefield of potential denunciations. Children like Dorothy Good became pawns in a system that conflated fear with evidence, her innocence and youth offering no shield against a community gripped by panic. Adults were equally ensnared. The socially prominent could fall as easily as the marginalized, as in the cases of Rebecca Nurse or Elizabeth Proctor. Even the well-respected were not immune. Status offered no real protection against spectral evidence, coerced confessions, or the relentless demands of the afflicted girls. In prisons, conditions were abysmal. Overcrowded, filthy, and cold, they were incubators for disease, despair, and death. Those awaiting trial sometimes lingered for months, chained to walls or crammed into tiny cells with inadequate food and sanitation. Some perished before a verdict could even be rendered, victims of neglect as much as fear. For those who survived, the psychological scars were lifelong. Broken families, lost property, and the constant reminder that hysteria could override reason and justice. By the time the trials concluded, the damage was staggering. 19 hanged, 1 pressed, 5 dead in jail, hundreds falsely confessed, and over 200 accused. Salem's streets and homes carried the weight of grief, suspicion, and trauma. The legal machinery that had legitimized spectral evidence, coerced confessions, and rewarded accusation had left a community fractured, forever haunted by the consequences of fear turned law. What had begun as whispers of the devil in the shadows ended as a cautionary tale of collective panic, moral panic, and the deadly power of human credulity when guided by superstition rather than reason. Ish grip. Slowly, the machinery of terror ground to a halt. The remaining accused were released, though many bore the scars of imprisonment, illness, and broken spirits. Families struggled to rebuild, reclaim property, and repair the fragile trust that had once bound the community. Church leaders publicly recanted support for spectral evidence, acknowledging its role in the injustice, and some of the surviving victims received small reparations or public apologies, though these gestures could never erase the trauma endured. Salem itself became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how fear, superstition, and social tension could combine to devastate an entire community. What began as a few afflicted children spiraled into a village-wide crisis, exposing vulnerabilities in the legal system, the dangers of unbridled rumor, and the perils of prioritizing panic over reason. For decades afterward, survivors and their descendants would wrestle with the memory of those months. The executions, the imprisonments, and the insidious power of collective hysteria. Ultimately, the Salem witch trials illustrate a timeless truth. Fear, once legitimized by authority and reinforced by ritual and rumor, can spread faster than reason. Even a small spark, a child's scream, a neighbor's accusation, or a misinterpreted dream can ignite widespread panic when society's structures fail to contain it. By the end of 1692, Salem had survived, but at the cost of innocence, trust, and the very sense of moral clarity that its residents had once believed guided them. The village, like its people, would forever carry the weight of that winter of fear, a testament to the consequences when humanity's darkest instincts are allowed to run unchecked. He stood before the community, acknowledging that fear and zeal had blinded him to reason, that his judgment had contributed to the deaths and suffering of innocents. His confession, while rare, was a small gesture toward reconciliation, a recognition that the machinery of law had been weaponized by panic and superstition. Yet for most, no apology could undo the trauma, the loss, or the enduring stigma carried by families for generations. In the aftermath, Salem slowly began to reconstruct itself, physically and socially. Homes were repaired, crops replanted, and daily life resumed, but the invisible scars lingered. People remained wary of sudden accusations, conversations carried a new tension, and suspicion quietly persisted in the corners of social interaction. Historians later noted that the collective memory of the trials influenced community behavior for decades. Caution replaced trust, and the lessons of 1692 became part of the moral and social fabric of New England. The trials also left a legal and theological legacy. Colonial authorities took steps to curb the misuse of spectral evidence, to ensure due process, and to temper communal fear with rational oversight. Clergy and educators used the events as cautionary tales, warning that hysteria unchecked by reason could destroy lives. Salem became a case study in the dangers of groupthink, the power of rumor, and the lethal potential of fear when entwined with authority. Though the gallows were silent and the jails empty, the memory of the Salem witch trials endured. For the survivors, every ordinary day carried reminders of lives lost, justice perverted, and innocence betrayed. The village had witnessed how fragile social bonds could be when fear eclipses reason, and how easily ordinary humans could become instruments of terror when guided by panic rather than prudence. Salem would never be the same, a cautionary shadow cast over the generations that followed, a community haunted, not by witches, but by the consequences of its own hysteria. Salem's story endures because it exposes the mechanics of collective fear, the vulnerability of human judgment, and the ease with which social and legal structures can be twisted into instruments of oppression. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, ministers, neighbors, were transformed into instruments of terror not by malice alone, but by a combination of belief, obedience, and the pressure of a community gripped by panic. The trials were not merely a failure of law. They were a failure of imagination, empathy, and the willingness to question authority. Even centuries later, the echoes remain. Legal scholars, historians, and civic leaders still reference Salem when considering due process, the dangers of mass hysteria, or the weaponization of religion and ideology. The lessons are universal. Systems meant to safeguard justice can be perverted when fear overrides reason, when rumor replaces evidence, and when silence is mistaken for guilt. Public accountability, clear legal standards, and critical thinking are not abstract virtues. They are shields against the very type of tragedy that unfolded on Gallows Hill. The village that became Danvers may have sought to bury its shame, but history refused to let it lie silent. The stories, the confessions, the names of the innocent hanged, Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, Giles Corey, are etched into the moral consciousness of a nation. Their deaths serve as enduring reminders that vigilance is required not just against imagined witches, but against the real human temptations of fear, conformity, and the abdication of moral responsibility. Salem teaches that justice is fragile, truth is precarious, and the consequences of panic can outlast even the most determined attempts to forget. The gallows are gone, yet the lesson remains. Unchecked fear, legitimized by authority, is among humanity's deadliest legacies. 49 BCE was a turning point not just for Curio but for Fulvia as well. As Caesar crossed the Rubicon, igniting civil war, Fulvia's role expanded beyond the domestic sphere. She coordinated communications between Caesar's allies in Rome, maintained the loyalty of Caius's former supporters, and helped marshal funds and provisions to support the campaigns. Sources hint that she even traveled to key locations to ensure political objectives were met, a level of involvement unusual for any Roman woman. Curio's campaigns in Africa and later in Sicily demanded constant attention and resources, and Fulvia became the linchpin of their urban political network. When Curio died in 49 BCE, felled in battle in Africa, Fulvia faced yet another personal and political blow. Yet, consistent with her previous pattern, she transformed tragedy into opportunity. Curio's death left a vacuum among the popularist factions in Rome, a vacuum Fulvia was determined to influence. She leveraged her inherited political credibility, her network of loyalists, and her reputation for fearlessness to maintain momentum. It was during this period that she began cultivating her next and most consequential partnership, Mark Antony. Already a rising military and political figure aligned with Caesar, Antony represented both continuity and expansion of Fulvia's influence. Their marriage around 47 BCE was as much a strategic alliance as a personal union. Fulvia brought political acumen, networks of support, and experience in mobilizing public opinion. Antony brought military power and acclaim to Caesar's inner circle. Together, they became one of the most formidable duos in the late Republic. Fulvia's involvement with Antony was anything but ceremonial. She coordinated political actions in Rome while he campaigned elsewhere, orchestrated propaganda efforts, and even financed operations that strengthened Antony's position. Ancient commentators often framed her as manipulative or power-hungry, but beneath the misogynistic lens lies a clear truth. She was exercising agency in a system designed to marginalize her. In a world dominated by generals, senators, and male ambition, Fulvia had become an indispensable player. Her trajectory, from Caius Pulcher's widow to Curio's ally to Antony's partner, demonstrates a pattern of turning personal circumstances into political leverage. Each loss, each transition, became an opportunity to assert influence, mobilize supporters, and shape Roman politics. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Fulvia refused to retreat into domestic obscurity. She leveraged marriage, spectacle, and networks to operate at the highest levels of power. In doing so, she challenged every expectation of what a Roman woman could and should do, carving out a place in history not merely as a consort but as a force to be reckoned with. In place, she proved more than capable of wielding all three. The Senate might mutter about her audacity, and the patrician matrons might pretend to faint at the thought of a woman directing armed gangs. But in the end, Rome respected results, however grudgingly. Fulvia ensured Antony's men were paid, that his political rivals in the city were harassed or undermined, and that his allies saw their loyalty rewarded. She could command street muscle one moment and negotiate with senators the next. This was not a ceremonial role. It was hands-on, bruising politics, and Fulvia thrived. She moved through the city with an entourage, a visible reminder that Antony's authority had not left with him. Her house became an unofficial headquarters, a place where debts were called in, favors arranged, and enemies marked for removal. But holding Rome together in Antony's absence came with a cost. Octavian, the young, calculating heir of Caesar, was no longer content to play the role of Antony's junior partner. He wanted Rome for himself. Fulvia, ever loyal to her husband's dominance, saw the threat clearly and decided not to wait for Antony to return before dealing with it. In 41 BCE, she and Lucius Antonius, Antony's brother, launched what amounted to an open challenge to Octavian's power. This was the Peasants' War, and it was no polite political quarrel. Fulvia mobilized troops in Italy, rallying veterans still loyal to Antony, and pushed for the restoration of his influence in Rome. Ancient sources, most of them hostile, paint her as the instigator, the one fanning the flames, urging Lucius to march on Octavian. Whether that's entirely fair or just another convenient way to blame a woman for a man's defeat is hard to say. But what's certain is that she took a direct hand in the conflict. She is even said to have addressed troops personally, an act nearly unthinkable for a Roman woman. In a society where elite women were meant to be symbols rather than actors, Fulvia had become a general in all but name. The war ended badly. Lucius Antonius was forced to surrender at Perugia in early 40 BCE, and Octavian's victory was decisive. Fulvia herself fled east to join Antony, who by then was in Egypt enjoying the company of Cleopatra. The reunion was not warm. Ancient gossip claims Antony was furious, blaming her for dragging him into an unnecessary war that weakened his position. Perhaps that's true, or perhaps Antony, faced with the cold reality of defeat, needed someone to take the fall. Either way, Fulvia's health declined soon after. By the summer of 40 BCE, she was dead, possibly from illness, possibly from the exhaustion of years spent fighting battles in a city that had never wanted a woman to fight them at all. She died far from the forum she had once dominated, leaving behind a legacy that Roman historians tried to smother under insults and moral condemnation. Yet the fact remains. Fulvia commanded armies, minted coins in her own name, and stood toe-to-toe with some of the most ruthless men in Roman history. Rome was never ready for Fulvia, but Fulvia, from the day she was born, was entirely ready for Rome. Fulvia's audacity in the Peasants' War was unprecedented. She was not merely a shadow behind her brother-in-law Lucius Antonius. She was the strategist, the financier, and the moral engine driving the rebellion. Ancient chroniclers, eager to diminish her, painted her as irrational or vengeful, but the facts suggest remarkable political and logistical acumen. She coordinated supplies, ensured soldiers were paid, and used propaganda to frame Octavian as a usurper. Letters from Antony in the east reveal a woman managing complex alliances, negotiating with allied towns, and keeping the Roman veterans loyal to her cause, all while the capital's political climate grew increasingly volatile. Her involvement was hands-on. Troops swore loyalty to Fulvia personally, a radical departure from Roman custom where female influence was expected to be indirect and symbolic. She attended councils of war, weighed in on strategic decisions, and carefully manipulated information reaching the soldiers. When Lucius Antonius hesitated, it was Fulvia who pushed for decisive action. She understood that momentum was critical in civil conflict. Delay meant attrition, desertion, or a propaganda victory for Octavian. Despite her tactical skill, the rebellion faced stiff resistance. Octavian, already a seasoned military operator and politically calculating, was not easily intimidated. The siege of Perugia became inevitable, and the rebels found themselves trapped. Fulvia reportedly advocated for a strategic withdrawal, but pride, loyalty to Antony, and the need to display authority over Lucius's legions constrained any retreat. Ancient sources describe the city suffering famine as Octavian's forces tightened their blockade. Soldiers and civilians alike endured hardship, yet morale remained buoyed by Fulvia's presence and rhetoric. Ultimately, the rebellion faltered. By early 40 BCE, Octavian secured Perugia, and the surviving forces were forced to surrender. Fulvia fled the city, reportedly making her way east to meet Antony in the provinces. While some accounts attribute the loss entirely to poor planning or Lucius's inexperience, it is undeniable that Fulvia had challenged Octavian's ascendancy in ways no Roman woman, or perhaps any woman of that era, had dared. Her name became synonymous with boldness, ambition, and a refusal to be sidelined in political and military affairs. The aftermath was personal and political. Antony, upon learning of the rebellion's failure, was said to be furious, blaming Fulvia for involving him indirectly in a costly misadventure. But the truth is more nuanced. She had acted in alignment with his interests, defending his allies, his veterans, and, by extension, his power base. In a patriarchal society, her assertiveness was recast as arrogance or hubris, but in context, it was disciplined political maneuvering. Fulvia's health, however, declined soon after the war. Stress, combined with years of relentless political engagement, likely contributed to her death in 40 BCE. Her passing deprived Antony of a partner whose competence had allowed him to extend his influence at home while he campaigned abroad. Ancient historians, particularly hostile ones like Cassius Dio, sought to minimize her impact, framing her as overambitious and blaming her for provoking civil unrest. But these interpretations ignore the unprecedented nature of her political and military agency. By the time of her death, Fulvia had reshaped what it meant to be a Roman woman. She had wielded power directly, commanded loyalty, influenced legislation, and acted decisively in moments of crisis. Coins bearing her image alongside Antony's stand as material testimony to her authority, a bold declaration that she was not merely a consort but a player in her own right. In retrospect, Fulvia's story is a study in adaptability and audacity. From orchestrating public outrage after the murder of Caius Pulcher to mobilizing troops in Italy and acting as Antony's proxy in Rome, she consistently leveraged the social, political, and military tools at her disposal. She exploited the fluidity of late Republican power structures to assert influence in ways male contemporaries could respect and fear. Fulvia died before witnessing the final reshaping of Rome under Octavian, yet her impact endured. She demonstrated that political and military acumen were not inherently male attributes, and that in moments of instability, authority could be seized by those bold enough to claim it. Rome may have been unready for Fulvia, but she had proven, repeatedly, that she was entirely ready for Rome. Her life remains a testament to ambition, strategy, and resilience, a reminder that historical narratives are often filtered through lenses of gendered bias, and that the full scope of power exercised by women like Fulvia can be glimpsed only when one reads between the lines of ancient, often hostile, accounts. Fulvia's shadow loomed long even after her death. She had been a storm in a society that preferred women to be gentle breezes, a strategist in a world that expected silence, a commander in a world that tolerated only spectators. Cleopatra may have captured Antony's later attention and the Roman imagination, but Fulvia had wielded real, tangible power, raising armies, directing political alliances, controlling the streets of Rome, and confronting Octavian himself. Few men of her time could claim such agency, and no Roman woman had done what she did. Her life, at its core, was a study in audacity. Born into a world that expected decorum and quiet compliance, she repeatedly broke those norms. She transformed grief into political theater, widowhood into opportunity, and marital alliances into strategic instruments of influence. Every move she made, from orchestrating riots in the Forum to coordinating troops in Perugia, was calculated, grounded in political understanding, and executed with precision. Rome exiled her, yes, but it did so not because she failed, but because she succeeded too well. She challenged patriarchal assumptions, destabilized power structures, and demonstrated that authority was not inherently male. Even her banishment highlights her threat. A woman who had once controlled public opinion, armies, and civic loyalty could not simply be ignored. She had to be removed physically for Rome to reassert its gendered norms. Fulvia's story also underscores the precarious nature of power in the late Republic. Alliances were fragile, loyalty often conditional, and the political landscape lethal. Antony may have relied on her skills while they were useful, but when her audacity collided with his strategic interests and romantic entanglements, she was discarded. History, particularly male historians of the time, recast her boldness as overreach, ambition, or even hysteria. In reality, she had acted with foresight, courage, and a rare understanding of both human psychology and political mechanics. Ultimately, Fulvia's legacy is double-edged. She is remembered in coins, letters, and chronicles, but filtered through the biases of historians who could not reconcile a woman with such overt power. She shaped events in Rome in ways few men could match and few women dared imagine. She commanded respect, loyalty, and fear simultaneously, yet the narrative often reduces her to a footnote overshadowed by Antony and Cleopatra. And that, perhaps, is the final irony. Fulvia changed Rome more profoundly than most remember, yet the history books, ever enamored with Cleopatra's romance and Antony's drama, rarely grant her the acknowledgement she earned. She was the prototype of female political agency in a world that forbade it, the woman who dared to command armies, raise the populace, and confront emperors, only to be exiled and erased once her presence became inconvenient. Her story is not one of failure but of audacity, brilliance, and unflinching resolve. Fulvia died at 43, far too young, but in her brief life, she demonstrated that power is not conferred by gender but seized with courage, cunning, and a willingness to act when others hesitate. Rome may have been unready for her, but Fulvia had faced it head-on, and in doing so, left a mark that history, when willing to look closely, cannot ignore. Fulvia's story is a study in how power, gender, and history collide. She wasn't merely a wife or a widow. She was a strategist, a commander, a force of political will operating in a world that had no precedent for a woman in her position. Rome had been built on the assumption that men ran politics and women endured it. Fulvia upended that assumption. She did not maneuver from shadows or whisper behind curtains. She acted publicly, decisively, and sometimes violently. She seized authority when others hesitated, marshaled resources when others wavered, and manipulated perception when others panicked. Her enemies, both personal and political, were quick to assign blame. The Perusine War, the rift between Antony and Octavian, the instability of Italy itself. These became, in historical memory, her responsibility. Ancient chroniclers like Ion, Dioasius, and Plutarch, largely male and aligned with the very power structure she had challenged, framed her ambition as dangerous, her influence as unnatural, her assertiveness as overbearing. In these accounts, Fulvia becomes less a political actor and more a cautionary tale, the woman who dared to act, and thus disrupted the order of things. But the evidence tells a more nuanced story. Fulvia operated within a political culture where violence, negotiation, and public spectacle were expected tools for men. In that context, she was no more aggressive than Caesar, no more ambitious than Pompey, and less ruthless than Octavian, whose rise to power would later consolidate the very structures Fulvia had challenged. Her crime, as it were, was not that she mismanaged Rome, but that she acted with the decisiveness and audacity of a man, and the Roman establishment simply did not have a place for that kind of female power. Even Mark Antony, for whom she had fought wars, raised armies, and preserved his influence in Rome, later cast her as the cause of discord. Following his reconciliation with Octavian and his politically expedient marriage to Octavia, Antony let Fulvia take the fall in history, conveniently shifting responsibility for civil unrest onto the woman who had once been his staunchest ally. In doing so, he erased her from the narrative while still benefiting from the infrastructure she had built. Loyal troops, a network of supporters, and public influence that remained firmly aligned with his interests. Fulvia's story is both tragic and revolutionary. Tragic because she was denied a posthumous voice and rendered a villain in the chronicles she could no longer contest. Revolutionary because, in the annals of Roman politics, she stands out as a rare example of a woman exercising genuine authority, commanding armies, negotiating alliances, and managing patronage networks in the capital itself. She demonstrated that women could not only participate in politics but could shape it, if society allowed them, even briefly. Her legacy is a paradox. Rome tried to erase her, but the traces of her audacity remained, in coins bearing her image, in letters preserved by her contemporaries, in the ripples her actions sent through the careers of men like Antony and Octavian. Fulvia's life, though cut short at 43, remains a testament to what happens when societal expectations collide with individual capability. She reminds us that history is often written by those who survive and consolidate power, not necessarily those who act with courage and intelligence. Fulvia was a woman ahead of her time, a political storm who refused to be contained, and the narratives that paint her as manipulative or dangerous reveal more about Roman discomfort with female authority than they do about her actual actions. Her story endures as a cautionary tale, not because of failure, but because of the radical audacity of a woman who refused to be invisible in a world that demanded it. She was not merely a footnote to Antony or a shadow to Cleopatra. She was a player in her own right, a prototype for every woman who would later navigate systems designed to exclude her. Fulvia wielded power, faced consequences, and left a legacy that survives, if only in the margins of history, as a reminder that leadership is not determined by gender, but by courage, skill, and the willingness to act when others cannot. Rome may have tried to forget her, but the memory of Fulvia endures. A woman who stood at the center of power, dared to command, and in doing so, challenged the very foundations of her world. Fulvia's story is a testament to the cost of breaking molds in a world unprepared for female agency. Antony's use of her death as a political tool effectively erased her from the spotlight, leaving no monuments, no ceremonial eulogies, no recognition of the extraordinary feats she had accomplished. Yet, as with all forces too large to contain, Fulvia's influence could not be entirely obliterated. She had commanded armies, orchestrated rebellions, directed patronage networks, and kept the machinery of Rome's politics turning in her husband's absence. Her name on Roman coinage was a revolutionary statement. A woman not as goddess, muse, or symbolic virtue, but as a political agent in her own right. The deliberate slander of her reputation by Roman historians, casting her as shrill, manipulative, and overambitious, was less a reflection of her actions than a reflection of Roman discomfort with a woman who exercised power without male sanction. Beneath the misogynistic caricature lies a strategist of extraordinary talent. Fulvia understood patronage, loyalty, and spectacle. She wove networks of influence across the urban masses, veteran soldiers, and senatorial factions, achieving feats that rivaled the most prominent men of her era. Her failures were never due to incompetence but to the structural impossibility of her position, a woman commanding authority in a society that refused to acknowledge female power. Her legacy persisted quietly but profoundly. Subsequent generations of Roman women, from Livia Drusilla to Agrippina the Younger, navigated the imperial world with lessons drawn from Fulvia's example. Cleopatra, operating in a different cultural context but echoing the same audacity, would wield political influence, command armies, and negotiate alliances in ways Fulvia had pioneered decades earlier. Fulvia's significance lies not in her ultimate exile or the vilification that followed her, but in her precedent. She demonstrated that women could step into arenas reserved for men and shape the course of history, even if their world refused to record it with fairness. In many ways, Fulvia's story underscores the fragility of memory and the biases embedded in historical narrative. Had she been a man, her audacity might have been celebrated as brilliance or cunning. Instead, she became a cautionary tale, a figure used to warn against female ambition. Yet history, even when biased, cannot entirely erase action. Fulvia's coins, her political maneuvers, and her influence during the most chaotic years of the late Republic remain undeniable evidence of her agency. Ultimately, Fulvia reminds us that power is not bound by gender, only by those willing or unwilling to recognize it. She shouted where others whispered, marched where others hesitated, and wielded authority where it had never been expected. Her death silenced her voice, but it could not silence her legacy. Every woman in Rome who later exercised influence behind thrones or over armies moved in the shadow of the precedent Fulvia set. She was not simply a footnote to Antony or an obstacle to Octavian. She was a revolutionary figure whose defiance continues to echo, waiting for readers willing to hear beyond the distortions of a patriarchal narrative. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a figure who had already begun to define himself as the moral compass of the movement. Calm yet commanding, he was a master of rhetoric and vision, able to translate collective frustration into a language that resonated across racial and socio-economic lines. King understood that this march needed more than bodies in the streets. It required narrative, symbolism, and a clear message. He worked closely with organizers like A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, who were the logistical geniuses behind the scenes, turning what could have been chaos into choreography. Every detail was scrutinized: where buses would arrive, how speakers would address the crowds, which leaders would appear on stage, and how media coverage could be leveraged to ensure the world was watching. By August of 1963, Washington, D.C. had begun to fill with tens of thousands of Americans converging on the National Mall. They came from every corner of the country, often traveling for days by bus or train, carrying signs and banners demanding justice, equality, and recognition of their humanity. The atmosphere was electric yet disciplined. Volunteers handed out water, medics patrolled the grounds, and stewards coordinated lines of marchers so that even a sea of humanity moved with remarkable order. The symbolism of the mall itself, the Capitol in view, the Washington Monument towering above, and the Lincoln Memorial anchoring the end, was not lost on anyone. These were not mere backdrops. They were monuments to a history of struggle and emancipation, and now they would witness a pivotal chapter in the ongoing fight for civil rights. As King prepared to speak, he understood the gravity of the moment. Millions of eyes, both literal and through the lens of television cameras, would be watching. The march was more than a demonstration. It was a statement that African Americans would no longer be silenced, that their collective will could not be ignored, and that change, long deferred, was inevitable. What unfolded on that August day would become one of the defining moments of the 20th century. A carefully orchestrated fusion of courage, planning, and moral clarity, creating a moment where history itself seemed to pause and take note. Everywhere you looked, order and purpose reigned. Volunteers guided the crowds, ensuring that aisles remained clear and that the mass of people moved without incident. First aid stations were set up like miniature field hospitals, and water stations dotted the mall to stave off heat exhaustion. Marshals wearing armbands coordinated the waves of marchers arriving from different streets, directing them to designated areas. Children sat atop shoulders, mothers held hands tightly with their sons and daughters, and elderly participants shuffled forward with determination that made the summer heat seem irrelevant. The signs were everywhere, bold and plain: "We demand equality, jobs and freedom now, end segregation." But more than the written words, it was the collective energy that filled the air. A soft hum of chants and songs drifted across the mall, a pulse that grew steadily louder as people found their voices together. Gospel music mixed with freedom songs, and even those arriving late seemed to instinctively understand the rhythm of the day. Unlike many large gatherings, there was no visible fear, no hint of panic, just an overwhelming sense of shared purpose. From the podium, leaders began to speak, each one a practiced orator with a carefully chosen message. While King's name would come to dominate the narrative, figures like Randolph, Rustin, and others reminded the crowd that this was a movement built on careful planning, coalition building, and unyielding moral conviction. Police watched quietly, not yet called into action, and even members of the federal government found themselves in awe of the spectacle unfolding before them. The combination of scale, discipline, and clarity of purpose made it unlike anything the Capitol had seen before. By mid-morning, the sea of faces stretched from the Lincoln Memorial to beyond the Washington Monument, a living testament to a movement no longer content with waiting. This wasn't just a protest. It was a demonstration of what organized, nonviolent collective action could achieve. A carefully choreographed moral statement designed to be impossible to ignore. Every chant, song, and sign was a piece of a larger narrative, one that the nation's leaders, the media, and the world would have to reckon with. The calm majesty of the crowd belied the stakes. A half-century of systemic oppression confronted by an unstoppable force of hope, courage, and unshakable resolve. King paused for a heartbeat, surveying the vast sea of faces stretching farther than the eye could see. A mixture of hope, determination, and quiet reverence reflected in every gaze. The hum of whispers and rustling papers faded into a tense silence, broken only by the soft shuffling of the crowd as people leaned forward, ready to absorb every word. Cameras clicked and microphones amplified the moment for a nation that had never seen anything like this. Then, with deliberate calm, King began to speak. His voice was steady, resonant, carrying over the hundreds of thousands gathered and into the hearts of those listening across radio waves. He spoke not with anger, but with moral authority, reminding the audience that the struggle for justice was not a passing impulse, but a continuation of centuries of hope, sacrifice, and resilience. Every sentence was precise yet poetic, each image he painted drawing the listener deeper into the vision he shared. A future where children of all races could sit together in harmony, where opportunity was not dictated by the color of one's skin, and where the promise of freedom was tangible, not deferred. As he built toward the crescendo of his address, the crowd leaned in collectively, as if their collective breath could carry his words further, amplifying the message of equality, dignity, and unrelenting hope. And then, in a moment that would echo through history, he delivered the line that would become immortal. The words of a dream, a blueprint for justice, and a challenge to the conscience of a nation. Time seemed to stretch, and even the wind seemed to pause, giving space for the weight and brilliance of the moment to settle over Washington, D.C. The March on Washington was no longer just an event. It had become a testament to the power of courage, coordination, and unshakable belief in the possibility of change. The crowd erupted, not with chaos, but with a collective, trembling joy that seemed to ripple through the National Mall like a wave. Hands shot into the air, some clasped in prayer, others raised in fists of determination. Tears streaked faces young and old. Voices joined in unison, repeating fragments of King's refrain as if echoing the very heartbeat of justice itself. It was a sound that carried far beyond Washington, bouncing across radios, newspapers, and the minds of millions who couldn't be there but felt every syllable as if it were spoken directly to them. What made the moment unforgettable wasn't just the soaring cadence of his words, but the moral clarity with which they were delivered. King had transformed statistics, grievances, and the weight of centuries of oppression into a vision so vivid it demanded belief. It wasn't rhetoric, it was a summons. The dream wasn't simply for the people on the Mall that day. It was a call to an entire nation to confront its conscience, to reckon with the dissonance between the promises of freedom and the reality of discrimination. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the reflecting pool, the crowd remained, unwilling to disperse. Choirs sang, children laughed, and strangers embraced, all sharing in the rare, electric certainty that history had shifted under their feet. For those hours, the nation's capital belonged to hope, to courage, and to the audacious dream of equality. And though the long road of civil rights would stretch on for decades, that day, August 28, 1963, became a luminous beacon, a proof that disciplined vision, moral clarity, and collective action could bend even the deepest arc of injustice toward justice. The organizers had struggled to ensure their contributions were visible without fracturing the carefully maintained unity of the march. Some women were asked to step back from speaking roles, relegated to logistical support or behind-the-scenes coordination, even though their influence was immense. Rustin himself had to navigate these tensions, balancing recognition for these activists while keeping the spotlight on King and the symbolic power of the march as a national statement. Meanwhile, the practical challenges were relentless. Every bus arrival had to be coordinated to avoid overcrowding, every medical station staffed, every route mapped to prevent confusion in the sweltering August heat. Volunteers acted as human traffic cones, directing the river of humanity streaming onto the National Mall. Food and water were rationed carefully. First aid stations were prepared for heat stroke, fainting, and minor injuries. Even the placement of portable toilets required precise calculation to accommodate 250,000 people without creating a health hazard. Yet, for all the planning and control, the crowd maintained a sense of calm and purpose that was almost miraculous. It was a testament to the discipline and training imparted by Rustin and his marshals, but also to the shared understanding that the march was bigger than any individual agenda. The participants weren't just attending an event, they were inhabiting history, contributing to a moral statement that would reverberate far beyond the reflecting pool. And when King finally rose to deliver the "I Have a Dream" passage, all of that orchestration, the planning, the logistics, the last-minute compromises, the careful suppression of internal disputes, coalesced into a single, breathtaking moment. Every face in the crowd, every hand held, every sign raised, every voice lifted in song or chant became part of a living chorus amplifying his words. The meticulous groundwork ensured that the speech didn't dissolve into chaos. Instead, it became an enduring symbol of what collective vision and disciplined organization could accomplish in the pursuit of justice. By the end of the day, the march had done more than convey demands for civil rights. It had demonstrated a new paradigm for activism. It proved that mass participation, careful strategy, and disciplined nonviolence could command the attention of a nation and shift its moral compass. Behind the smiles, cheers, and tears, the movement's leaders knew that this was just the beginning. The march had set a standard, created a blueprint, and sent a clear message. Change was no longer optional, and those demanding it were prepared to be seen, counted, and heard. Television broadcasts replayed snippets of the "I Have a Dream" passage over and over, embedding King's cadence and imagery into the national consciousness. Radio stations discussed the size of the crowd and the novelty of such a disciplined, interracial gathering. Even local papers in the Deep South reluctantly acknowledged that something unprecedented had occurred, though their coverage often couched the event in suspicion or mild condescension. Politically, the march put immense pressure on Congress and the Kennedy administration. While the civil rights leaders had no illusions that a single demonstration would overturn segregation overnight, the scale and discipline of the protest forced politicians to acknowledge the legitimacy and urgency of the movement. President Kennedy praised the nonviolent nature of the event, calling it one of the greatest displays of patriotism he had witnessed, while simultaneously cautioning that meaningful legislation still required negotiation and compromise. The march had shifted the conversation from moral appeal to political inevitability. Back in the movement, organizers took stock of both victories and ongoing challenges. The visibility of women's labor, though understated, could not be erased entirely. Ella Baker's mentorship and Dorothy Heights community networks had ensured the march's logistical success, even if they had been sidelined from major speaking roles. SNCC and CORE, while frustrated by their limited recognition, understood that the march had elevated the movement's profile and built momentum for local campaigns, voter registration drives, and continued nonviolent protest. Meanwhile, ordinary participants returned home carrying the memory of standing shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of thousands of fellow Americans. Letters were written to newspapers, church congregations recounted the experience, and activists used the momentum to rally communities previously hesitant to act. The march became both a moral and practical template. Disciplined organization, broad coalition building, and visible nonviolence could reshape public perception and force the hand of lawmakers. For the nation at large, the March on Washington crystallized an emerging truth. Civil rights were no longer a regional issue confined to the South. They were a national imperative. The images of unity and dignity broadcast across newspapers and television sets challenged stereotypes, confronted denial, and inspired young people across the country. For Black Americans, the march was both a statement of presence and a declaration of possibility, a tangible moment where dreams met strategy, hope intersected with discipline, and history paused to take notice. Their presence transformed hope into a public declaration that injustice would no longer go unchallenged. The March on Washington was more than a gathering. It was a masterclass in collective courage, in demonstrating that ordinary people, when organized, could bend the arc of history toward justice. It proved that discipline, vision, and unity could amplify voices long silenced, forcing a nation to confront its contradictions. The ripple effects were immediate and enduring. Locally, churches, schools, and community centers became hubs for voter registration drives, educational campaigns, and peaceful demonstrations. Young people who had witnessed the march returned to their towns emboldened, organizing sit-ins, freedom rides, and protests that would define the next phase of the civil rights movement. Nationally, politicians who had previously dismissed civil rights activism as fringe or disruptive found themselves under unprecedented scrutiny. The moral clarity of the march made evasion impossible. Internationally, the event sent shockwaves. Global media coverage highlighted the United States' contradictions between its democratic ideals and systemic racial oppression. Diplomatic discussions, already tense in the Cold War context, were now colored by the moral weight of American domestic injustice. The march became a benchmark for evaluating civil rights and human rights in other nations, inspiring activists from South Africa to Northern Ireland to look at mass, nonviolent mobilization as a path to change. For the participants, the memory of that day endured not merely as history but as a touchstone of possibility. They had seen democracy in motion, not a theoretical construct, but a living, breathing force shaped by people who refused to remain passive. That unity, discipline, and courage under the oppressive heat of August in 1963 demonstrated that change was not just desired, it was achievable. And so, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the towering columns of the Lincoln Memorial, the crowd had done more than listen. They had participated in a moment where vision, strategy, and moral clarity converged. The speeches, the songs, the disciplined energy, all of it became a blueprint for future generations. More than 6 decades later, the lessons of that day remain vivid. Justice requires courage, equality demands persistence, and the voice of the people, when lifted in unison, is unstoppable. The dream of 1963 continues to echo, calling every generation to act, to march, and to speak, ensuring that the work begun that sweltering summer day is never complete, but always in motion.